Shulk, you're spending too much Shulk time simming the Monado. You should get out.
Dunban, are you awake yet?
Tempest kick! Is it Fiora? Time already? You didn't have to bring yourself?
Don't be sussy.
Don't treat me like an imposter!
Dunban, don't say that.
Such is vital to a superior brighty Fiora! Such just are vital to a superior brighty Fiora! Park man is vital to a
You
snare. It is vital. Ah! Right, I see.
I really thought I lost you back then.
Yes, but now I'm almost well enough to handle the Monado again.
Do you want it to fuck you?
Yeah! I'm prepared. Well, I'm sure you'd like Shulk to try the Monado while it's still hot.
That's okay.
Don't feel like you need to stay. I have to be prepared to fuck Monado again.
Need Monado. They say that before time began, it was that's how it was able to fuck Dunban.
Shulk!
No! Need Monado. If I can just unlock. Ah! I see it. This is great.
Man is vital.
It's always delicious.
Are you peace today?
What?
Are you peace? The breeze feels so good.
Yeah. The Monado, it's amazing. Ah!
You're spending too much time with Ryan. You're getting used to all the lifesaver jokes.
Yeah, maybe.
You know, Shulk, I hope you can be.
Huh? The breeze siren. There might be.
Alley-oop, here's how it's done. Oh, yeah.
Ryan?
Yeah, I like it. Oh, yeah.
Ryan! What are you doing? You two-timing rat!
No,
How could you do this to me? You cheating love rat!
I'm riding the waves, man.
That is extremely irritating. Makes me so mad.
Impressive movement.
I was having a good day until you ruined it. Ah! You vicious sod! Ryan! It's buckled.
Don't you care about me?
You're not the Monado, are you? More importantly, what were you thinking, Ryan?
Sorry, I just wanted the Monado to touch me. I came to ask you, but you weren't here. And I saw the Monado and I came...
I know I'm here a lot to sim, but even I need fresh air sometimes. Is your body still feeling numb?
Sorry. But is it true? The Monado really can't touch people.
Maybe it's a sim.
You think it's... a sim?
Why were you more worried about a machine than me, Shulk?
Mech on armor.
What?
Hey? More importantly... flashing your stuff, eh? Okay then, do it. Marvelous. I love it when you do your hot stuff.
Look at you!
Until I've scrapped it.
Of course!
BIONIS.
Are you a...
BIONIS.
Ryan, when you held the Monado,
BIONIS.
did you see anything?
You know, BIONIS.
I don't mean that. Was it only me?
Looks like Dunban really is the only one who can... BIONIS.
I won't let my brother fuck the Monado ever again. Not after what it did to him.
BIONIS.
Anyway, to be honest, this has happened a few times before. I've been searching for a Monado. Wow, that's it! Anyway, Ryan, what did you want to ask me about?
BIONIS. Fancy tagging along?
Are these the man?
The Defense Force often uses it for training, but I come here to do research.
Not surprising.
Did you collect the cylinders?
BIONIS.
Shh, be quiet.
Please, let's go back. I don't want to be...
Huh? What's going on?
Listen, what is that?
That sound. In the sky!